Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
There he is.
Hey, Chad. Well, did you not want to record?
it literally, when you hit go, it said, snap, and it went away. So I don't know what the heck happened, but that was
okay. I just assumed
really bad timing.
You got a little stage fright. Click the stop button there.
Oh, man, that was bizarre.
Yeah. Well, I was leading in, our season down here just ended. Some of the other southern seasons, they're about to end if they haven't already.
We got a little over a week left.
Yeah, and you guys are just getting cranked up. So, we're kind of shifting, I guess, to something else here, or at least some people are, whereas a lot of your folks up that way are shifting to turkeys right now. So, well, we're getting a lot of requests to talk about something other than the South. We have a little bit. We've talked to some folks up in the Northeast, some in the Midwest, but I'm glad to have you guys today to move a little farther north and a little farther west. So thanks, guys, for coming. And today we have Chad Lehman, and you work for South Dakota DNR. Is that correct? Can you?
Yeah, the official name would be South Dakota Department of Game, Fish, and Parks. And I'm in the Terrestrial Resources Division. Yes, right.
All right. And your role there, this is going to be a problem.
We drop Chad again so we can move on and let Chris introduce himself, I suppose, in the meantime.
Also, Dr. Chris Rota, know your name well, but I'm not sure that we have spoken in the past. But we appreciate you taking some time to visit with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
All right, we got you back, Chad.
I'm back.
This might be a recurring
really
theme.
Nothing to worry about here. We're really easygoing, fun conversation.
Yeah. And so the reason that we wanted to have both of you guys on is obviously because you're ongoing research collaborations in South Dakota. So maybe that's, Marcus, I don't know if you had an idea for a different starting point, but I thought that might be a good one to describe, what questions y'all been working on and how long that's been ongoing.
Yep, that's where I wanted to start.
Chad, you want me to lead out on this one?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah,
I'll add anything you miss.
Okay, so Chad and I have been working, I'd say, since 2016 on turkeys in the hills. Started with a project in northeast South Dakota, Grant County, and some associated counties up there. We're investigating causes of long-term declines in turkey harvest, and so we were interested in pulling together a demographic model, a population model that looked at survival of hens and not survival of hens, so that we could identify which factors might be contributing to the decline. We can understand factors influencing nest success, factors influencing hen survival, and use that to identify appropriate management that might be used to address that decline. We've actually got an ongoing study right now in Gregory County, south central South Dakota, just west of the Missouri River bordering Nebraska. It's our second turkey project, and we're entering the second field season of that right now. Our grad student just arrived this morning. I got a text from him saying he just got there. And the same theme with that one as well. We're looking at Merriam's now in the Gregory County study, but long-term decline in harvests, and looking at hen survival, nest survival. I collaborated with Chad on some Merriam stuff in the Black Hills. I wasn't helping collect those data, but yeah, a lot of my collaboration comes in as a population ecologist, where we help with the analysis of the survival and nest success data, putting it into a demographic model, and trying to understand which of those demographic rates are most strongly driving the populations.
So, kind of leaning into that a minute, when you were talking about the long-term declines in harvest, can you guys describe what does that look like across the state in terms of how long-term, how much has harvest declined? Does it change between the eastern and the Merriam range, those kinds of things?
And y'all have Rios too, right? So y'all have 3 subspecies there.
So the Rio population is what I would call a relic population from the 70s. We did some reintroductions back in the 70s where we did a handful of Rio Grande reintroductions in south central South Dakota, primarily east of the Missouri River. So it'd be down there in that south central corridor between the Missouri and Mitchell kind of vicinity when you're talking that riparian corridor. So those populations, there could be some genetics of some Rios in there, but it's primarily going to be eastern turkeys, as I said, east of the Missouri, based on our reintroduction efforts going back to 1993. We've been putting easterns in that eastern agriculture habitat primarily, and then everything west of the Missouri is going to be Merriam's turkeys. So I would say there's a potential to harvest a Rio there in that south central part, but for the most part, you're going to be harvesting eastern birds east of the Missouri and Merriam's west of the Missouri River.
Okay.
And going back to your idea of harvest, we've seen declines in harvest going back to the mid 2000s. We peaked at about 2006, 2007, and 8. And since that time, we've just seen a fall like everybody else has across the United States. Turkey populations have been declining. And that's why Chris and I come in with our research. We're trying to identify what's going on. Is it adult hen survival? Is it reproduction? Can we protect those hens during the fall harvest? When we have fall seasons, close those seasons down and maybe allow some recovery of those populations. Maybe it's a habitat question we're trying to answer to see if we can fill a need there. So yeah, there's questions across the board that we're trying to answer, but it all basically boils back down to we want more turkeys on the landscape. How do we get to that point?
Sure. And so through that research where y'all looked into all these various factors that are playing into vital rates, what have you seen as some of the recurring trends that come up in these studies that you've completed so far?
Well, in the papers that Chad and I have published, we've really seen that hen survival is what really strongly drives population growth. That's what we saw in Rena's study. She's the graduate student that worked on a project in northeast South Dakota. She's actually at Pennsylvania right now. She does up and game bird stuff there. So I'm gonna give a shout out to Rena, who did the hard work on.
I actually met her maybe a month and a half ago.
Okay.
I was in Pennsylvania, and she was at an event that I was speaking at, and we introduced ourselves and talked for a few minutes.
Yep. So so Rena found that hen survival is what really drove population growth there, and it's the same thing that Chad and I found with Merriam's in the hills on a paper we had there. We did some modeling work, and we found that really the only thing that we could do to get the population to grow was increase that hen survivorship. So
that's even in contrast to increasing nest success or brood survival, which is where most turkey hunters' minds first go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So Chris, just out of curiosity, what kind of annual survival rate were you seeing?
Yeah, pretty low. without having my paper in front of me to remind me of the exact numbers, it was in the low 50s or high 40s.
Okay, that is low.
Yeah, it was in the 40s. It was bad.
Okay, it was pretty bad, and different causes where you go. When we were in Grant County, predation was the leading cause, but there was the second leading cause was hens getting hayed while on the nest.
Getting run over by a haying machine.
That's exactly right. Yep. And we didn't really have that with the Merriams in the Black Hills. I think that was mostly the early spring, late winter survival of those birds.
Yeah, so harsh winter conditions.
Yeah, in the Black Hills, we had some tremendous, some terrible winters, and when those birds, when we actually weighed those turkeys, when you compare the weights of those turkeys compared to, for instance, let's say Grant County or Gregory County, they were much lighter birds coming into nesting. So they were struggling just to make it through winter and get into the nesting season with the endogenous energy reserves that they needed to even produce nests. We actually had a bird that starved to death. This is the first documented case that I've ever heard of while incubating a nest. It had 6 eggs, starved to death in mid-July, and we found it dead. It basically lost over 40% of its body weight, and we found it just laying there next to this nest. So,
wow,
those are the kind of conditions we're talking about. These animals have to come through these incredibly harsh winters, and then on top of that, in the northern Black Hills, we get these really cold, wet springs. So they're out there laying on these nests for 26 days, and then they got this cold, wet rain on top of them. So they're trying to maintain their metabolic rate while they're incubating these nests, and it takes a tremendous amount of energy for these birds to hatch these birds out. So if they don't have those fat reserves coming in, you're going to see things like that, higher starvation rates, that kind of thing. And not only that, the maintenance on the nest, if you're not able to, obviously sit there and incubate these nests properly, predators are going to come in and be able to track them down and get them as well. So there's a lot of things that go into this. And yeah, the Black Hills, that northern Black Hills in particular, we just don't see the number of turkeys up there that you would even in the central and southern Black Hills. We've done research studies in the past as well, covering areas in the central Black Hills and the southern Black Hills, and we see much different survival rates as you move further south, and also you see increased nest survival as you move further south. Drier, warmer conditions, the birds just do better there, not only with higher survival rates, but with nest survival rates as well.
Wow. So did y'all find that there's anything that y'all can do to move the needle on hen survival? Obviously, if we can avoid mowing or haying while hens are on the nest, that would be something that we personally have direct and immediate control over. If we're a turkey enthusiast trying to increase, recruitment on a given piece of ground. But then outside of that practice, is it all just, are you at the whims of the weather in a particular winter and spring?
I'll take a stab at the mowing thing, Chad, and then you fill in.
Okay, you can go with that, and then I'll talk about weather.
Yeah. I mean, the mowing one's hard, especially when agriculture is such an important part of the economy up where you are there. I mean, not haying is lost income.
Right.
There's NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. They publish some guidelines on bird-friendly haying. You can delay your haying. There's certain practices you can do starting in the center and mowing out that give birds a chance to escape. But barring incentives, those are practices that are hard to change at a large scale. And I think that more ag fields is a consequence of having a declining CRP, conservation reserve program fields, and that might be what I have to say about that. I'll pass it on to Chad unless there's follow-up.
Well, Chris, I did have a quick question. So when Can you tell us when would you expect the peak incubation to be occurring based on your studies?
Yeah, peak incubation. I think we're not quite there yet. Chad, I think you can answer that one better than me.
Yeah, so when we were talking East River, it's a little bit later than what we have out west. So I would say you're probably coming in around May 12th through the 18th up there in Grant County. So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so in terms of the haying, it sounds like to me, based on that, the window of time where it's really problematic would be May.
Well, that and into June, so you're going to have some carryover. You know, a 26-day interval. If you could, we try in South Dakota. We actually will do some publicity on this, where we try and let the producers know if you can hold off until July. That's huge, right? Because most of those first nests, not only for turkeys but for pheasants, are going to be in that May-June timeframe. So you give them the chance for those first nests then to get off, successfully hatch, and then you could come in and hay after that. So for us, June 1 is kind of a big number, that calendar date that we look forward to when we're talking about delayed haying. So then go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, how practical is that for a producer? Is it practical?
Well, it's depends on the precip. So right, if they get really good conditions early, they're going to want to get that first hay crop off, probably in June. So, you know, we can promote that delaying the haying, but you know, the producers are going to try and produce, right? They're going to get out there and get their hay. So it's up to the individual, the private landowner at that point.
Sure.
Yeah, and I saw, Chad, in the in one of those papers that touched on this, that there was a recommendation you guys included to equip tractors with, I think it was called a flushing bar. Do you see widespread adoption of that practice, or is that something that makes the producer inefficient as well?
No, I think we do have producers that use those actually, and a lot of those guys are obviously interested in at least saving the hen, right? So if they put these flusher bars on, at least the hen can get away, and they may lose the nest. But the good news is, with gallinaceous birds like turkeys and pheasants, they'll nest again, right? So they'll they'll go find an area where there is sufficient dense nesting cover and then nest. So no, we actually do have folks that use those in South Dakota.
That's great. Yeah, and I think that's something you just made a point that's really important for folks to understand is losing a nest is bad enough, but you lose a hen, you lose not only her potential production that year if she renests, but her lifetime fecundity as well.
Yep, absolutely. And that's, I think, why we're finding such a strong relationship between population growth and hen survival.
Right.
Is because it's that all the potential reproduction that you're losing when that hen dies.
So what about, we never really got to, and I know we went down several different rabbit trails, but I did want, Chad, if you could speak to the weather for a little bit. If, you know, is that something that you guys are just at the mercy of when it comes to hen survival and nest success, or?
No, absolutely. I mean, in South Dakota, we go from typically East River around 20 inches annually of precip to where in the southern Black Hills, southeastern South Dakota, we may only get, 16 to 17 inches annually. So we go through drought cycles, we go through wet cycles, and it's just a bumpy ride for us here in South Dakota related to how much rain we get. And the timing of the rain is critically important, right? You want to be able to produce that cover, that grass out there that they need for nesting. So the timing of it's critically important. And rain is especially a tricky one. Chris and I have done a lot of modeling related to precipitation while the hens are on the nest incubating. And one of the things that can happen is if they get too much rain while they're on the nest, there's this hypothesis out there called the stinky bird hypothesis. So the hens on the nest,
the wet hen hypothesis,
the wet hen theory,
too.
Wet hen theory. Yep. So if the hen gets wet, they have this bacteria on their body and it gets activated. And anybody that's handled turkeys as much as Chris and I have when we've radio collared them, when they're wet, they really do smell. It's quite remarkable. And so what this does is it gives predators like coyotes and red foxes and skunks and all of these predators that are out there, they use olfaction. They can smell these things, particularly downwind. They get downwind of the bird while they're incubating, and they just come up that scent trail, and they may not kill the hen, but they at least get the eggs. So the more rain you get while the hen's incubating, you could potentially influence nest survival. You could see decreases in nest survival. Now, the other thing about it is, though, when it's dry, if it's droughty, and we saw this in Rena's study, you're going to need enough rain to produce the vegetation for them to nest in. So it's a slippery slope, right? You still got to produce the habitat that's there. So you got to have some rain, obviously. They see this in Texas, right? They seem to have more bumper crops with Rios down there when they have more rain versus less versus a drought. So you've got to have that balance there of precip. So yeah, I mean, right now we're in South Dakota, we're looking good. We've had 2 years of the optimal amount of rain, I would say, and it's been warmer, so we haven't had the cold, wet rains. So we are seeing 2 years of pretty good reproduction across the entire state the last 2 years.
That's good news.
That is really good news. And, while we were going through this, while you're going through that just then, Chad, two things came to mind for me. One, Marcus, is I think this is really interesting because we've talked about the Rio example a lot on here as kind of a proof of concept that the relative quality of the range that a particular hen is occupying can potentially influence, whether she chooses to participate in nesting, if she does participate, when that occurs, and then probably also like how often that she has to go on recess and leave that nest during the incubation phase. But here we're presented with another example from a different part of the country where, we've got things like winter severity and spring weather that are also influencing hen body condition and influencing her ability to provide that level of maternal care. So I think that's just an interesting proof of concept that the relative quality of the habitat that you provide, translates into the performance, the reproductive performance of that population in so many different ways. It's not just hiding the hen in her nest. There's all these other factors that play into the reproductive ecology of the bird.
Yeah, potentially even how much she smells.
Absolutely. And that was the other thing that I was going to ask about. Maybe this is a little bit far-fetched, but we talked to Craig Harper a while back, and he said that in Tennessee, overhead cover was an important determinant of probability of nest success. And I always assumed that was something that was related to predation, particularly from aerial predators that may be able to see the nest from above. But when Chad said that just then about the wet hen hypothesis, it made me wonder, because I think I read through one of y'all's abstracts that kind of similar finding about overhead cover. I wonder if that might help keep some of that water off the hen and keep her from providing as much of an olfactory cue to those predators.
Yeah, overhead cover really hasn't been a critical covariate in our studies. What we've seen is lateral cover, the cover, that the visual obstruction that they need. Most of our predators are going to be on the ground. We're talking about coyotes, red fox, skunks, raccoons. Those are the kind of predators. They also use olfaction. So I think that for the most part, it's the lateral cover and the amount of precip. We have seen some great horned owl predations on the nest. It's really small. I mean, below 5%. And we definitely have seen great horned owl predations on turkey nests where they don't have that overhead cover. An instance for this that I recall, or just off the top of my head, is common juniper is a shrub that they really rely on in early nesting here in the Black Hills. And a lot of times there won't be that overhead cover unless it's a really tall shrub, a big shrub. And so that hen is exposed. If a great horn flies right above that thing and perches above it, it can clearly see that bird down in that shrub patch. So we've seen some predations like that. But for the most part, it just has not been a very important covariate. Lateral visual obstruction is critically important, that shrub cover, whether that's grasses, shrubs, even woody debris. You might just see, logs laying out there, rocks, trees can be important cover for these birds as well. But, the precip thing, we've seen it where it hasn't been important in some studies, like Rena's study. But in many of our studies, we have seen precip does decrease nest survival particularly during the incubation period while the hen's on the nest.
And Chad, were y'all able to establish any kind of threshold for that precipitation? Like, is there a line that it crosses where you think, oh man, this is going to affect nesting this year for sure?
Oh, absolutely. So you guys talked about, maybe that hen doesn't get wet. So if you typically don't, if you see, less than 0.1 centimeters, everything's metric with scientists, right? So typically that's not enough rain to get a hen wet. But if you get above that, on multiple days, if an average incubation time's 26 days, the more time she gets that, 0.1 or more, the likelihood of the probability would be that she's probably going to get hit by a nesting predator. So definitely a threshold. It's got to be, more than probably 0.05, 0.1 centimeters at one washing, one flushing of rain. So, and we sometimes will get a big, 1 to 2 inches, but typically it's those long, wet, cold rains that we get that can impact nest survival.
Yeah, that's not much of a threshold.
Yeah, so basically, if it rains a quarter of an inch on a day,
yes,
she's dead.
That's a good rough estimate. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I just
it rains a quarter of an inch here when it doesn't rain. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, we get a quarter inch of humidity a day.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that was not what I was expecting you to say was the threshold.
No.
Well, you know what? I bet if I went to that part of the world and spent a little time, I'd get a bloody nose, just because when I moved from this humid climate to that dry climate. Good grief. Okay, I had another question that I was thinking through while y'all were talking. What about hen body condition? Is there anything that you're in control of that influences hen body condition, or is that all at the whim of the winter?
Yeah, a lot of that's related to winter conditions. So one thing we have seen is when you've collared hundreds of turkeys like Chris and I have, we've also radio collared yearling females and adult females. And it really doesn't seem like it matters too much if that bird weighs more than 3.5 kilograms, again, back to metric, they've got a much higher likelihood they are going to nest. We've just seen if they're below that 3.5 kilogram threshold, they're probably not going to nest. They're not going to have enough fat reserves, body mass to produce enough eggs. So there's definitely a threshold there related to body weight too. And that can vary year to year depending on the winter. So if we have this mild winter, obviously the birds can maintain that body mass and you'll see a higher nesting rate then based on just the winter conditions. It's pretty remarkable.
Thinking through this, I mean, I would expect that our weather being much more moderate, down in the south, to put it lightly, I think that the winter severity would probably be much less of a factor in determining that hen body condition coming into spring, and more so things like mast crop. Although there have been a couple studies trying to link mast crop to hen body condition, and I don't know that anyone's done it successfully.
Yeah, up in the Virginias, right? Well, but we do have at least 2 examples that we've covered before, Will. One from Minnesota and one from Arkansas that showed the same pattern where hen body condition as it was determined by weight at capture was strongly linked to the initiation of a nest, the size of the clutch, the success of the hen, all those factors. I've never heard anybody talk about one being in such poor condition that they literally starve.
I think that's an incredible testament to their dedication to the nest at that point.
Yeah, they can lose up to about 40 to 42% of their body weight, and then they tip over. They can't. Yeah, they starve to death and die. So, yeah, I mean, and you guys talked about mass crop in the South. That actually can be important for a lot of our turkeys, particularly out in the prairie habitats where we have bur oak. You know, our study in Gregory County, bur oak's a big mass crop. They definitely have years where there's more acorns, so they definitely supplement their diet with acorns. There's ag there. Obviously, corn is a high energy food that these birds utilize for sure around these ag fields. And then when you get to the Black Hills, the main mass crop for them is going to be ponderosa pine seed. So there you've got these, you know, these robust ponderosa pine forests producing all this seed. About every 3-4 years, we have this bumper crop of ponderosa pine seed, and you'll know it. You'll see where these birds are scratching underneath these dense ponderosa pine stands, and they're getting after that seed, and that's their primary winter crop for their mass. So there could be some tie-ins there as well with obviously maintaining that body mass going into nesting, which is critically important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And is there anything that y'all can do to try to make that, even to enhance those areas that are important to turkeys, or is it more just focused on conserving the ponderosa pines and the bur oaks where they occur?
Oh, absolutely. You know, silvicultural practices in the Black Hills can promote those older, mature ponderosa pine forests. So we're looking at things like 9-inch and bigger trees, DBH. So that's diameter at breast height. You want the bigger trees, and you want the higher density of those trees. Those stands are going to produce more pine seeds. So when we make our management recommendations for turkeys, particularly for winter habitat, we want to provide those larger trees, more dense ponderosa pine trees for the winter habitat. When you're talking nesting and brood rearing, of course, you're talking early successional, more open stands, meadow edges, those kind of things. But when you're talking winter habitat, we want those bigger pumpkins out there producing pine seed for sure. So yeah, we can make some changes there structurally in the forest to help us. Out on the prairie with you're kind of left to the devices of private land. 99% of our prairie habitat's private, so we work with our private biologists. We have private lands biologists out in the field. They work with the private landowners to try and promote that. Obviously, the mass crops, the oak stands, and those kind of things, as well as, you know, we've got some habitats out there that are losing roost trees. So cottonwood, green ash trees are important roost trees out there too. So promoting those riparian corridors is critically important in the prairie habitats.
Mm-hmm. What about in the open areas, Chad, outside the forest and woodlands? Are there major habitat management issues that y'all face there? Like, I don't know, just any invasive species or things like that you have to contend with that influence brooding and nesting cover?
Well, that's funny you bring that up. That's actually one of the hypotheses that Chris and I are looking at here in Gregory County. You guys have heard of red cedar. That's an invasive species, particularly in south central South Dakota, that has definitely been encroaching on not only the native oak riparian habitats that we have, but it's also invading our grassland prairie habitats. So the ranchers out there are trying to do a lot of prescribed burning to knock this stuff back, because if you look at the research that we did back when my old advisor, Dr. Lester Flake, was looking at Merriam's turkey nesting ecology back in the 80s, there was hardly no red cedar. And now if you look at what we're dealing with now, there's so much more of that on the landscape that one of our hypotheses is that maybe this red cedar isn't good for turkey nesting or nest survival. We're going to see here once this study concludes, but that's definitely a species of concern for us potentially for turkeys in that country.
Sure.
So I had to, I'm still trying to think through, you know, a private landowner in the east part of the state that it has an interest in the agriculture. I guess that's probably the majority of them. So they're the landowner that's haying. What do you have any recommendations that you can give to people for what they should do, best management practices, I guess, but also, you know, how is that impacting them from a financial standpoint, and are there ways to curtail that?
Well, this varies a lot depending what county you're in, right? Obviously, we are really interested in maintaining larger ranches that are cattle producers. And by that, I mean, we would rather see folks keep native grass, native prairie on the landscape, right? With cattle, that then they can rotationally graze those cattle to maintain those pastures in condition to where there's grass on the landscape for these birds to nest in, right? What happens is when you start cultivating a high proportion of these fields, you're going to start losing a lot of that dense nesting cover. So obviously, having a mosaic of agriculture and grasslands is important because you've got that winter food for them. But having the right percentages of those is important, I think, particularly for turkeys, because it seems like when you move further east, where we have higher percentages of more ag, less pasture, we have lower adult survival typically, and for sure that the reproduction component goes way down. We just don't see that the nesting and the poult survival. We're not producing as many poults per hen, particularly in those habitats that we don't have the riparian and the grasslands. We've actually done some reintroductions of eastern turkeys in areas less than 10% of good, what I would call turkey habitat. This would be roosting trees, grassland cover, these kind of things that they've got to have. These are primary habitat components. When you get below 10%, we just don't see the demographic rates that you got to have to sustain populations. You get above that 10% threshold, even 15, 20%, we've got pretty robust turkey populations in some of those areas. So that's kind of a magic number we throw out there. When we have private landowners come to us as a state agency saying, hey, I want to have turkeys on my place, we'll go out and look at their place and tell them, this just isn't in the cards. You guys just don't have enough roosting habitat, dense nesting cover, grassland habitat. So we visit with those folks all the time, our private landowners with our private biologist, private lands biologist, and then we'll provide technical advice to those folks and let them know whether or not they think they might have a shot at having turkeys on their place.
That's interesting. Well, so you guys said that the hen survival in one of the studies was in the 40s. Did you do any forecasting or any sort of modeling to see what did it need to be to get the lambda above 1 so that your population was growing?
Yeah. Oh, with the Black Hills and the Merriams, we did an exercise where we kept everything constant except for one of these demographic rates at a time. Chad, correct me if my ballpark is wrong because I don't have the paper in front of me, but I think it was in the 60s. You had to get hen survival into the 60s to have a growing population. That
is correct. Yeah, right at that lower 61, 62%. If we could get it to that, then we'd be growing again. Yep.
Yeah.
And y'all aren't harvesting any females, are you? Hunter harvest?
So, a little bit.
It is a little bit. And like I said, our populations have recovered. We're seeing harvests come back. The last 2 years now, all of a sudden, conditions are right again, and we're creeping back up there. So now our managers, we're dealing with private landowners again, right? So now we're starting to hear more from the landowners saying, hey, we got enough turkeys here. It's time to lower the population a little bit. And that's our tool in the toolbox. We come in with a fall season and we can open that up and start steadily increasing tags to increase that hen harvest then. So in places where we want to grow populations, we typically keep the fall season closed, right? And then when we want to get into them a little bit, then we'll crack those up, and then we'll have fall seasons.
And the primary conflict that you might start to see when populations get too high is agricultural damage?
Yes. So in a lot of our prairie units, a lot of these birds will come in and around the farmstead areas where there's the stored feed grains. They'll have storages of primarily oat hay bales maybe, or even stored corn. If that's out in the open and the birds can get to those, that's available to the birds. They'll get in there and get after it, and they'll do some depredation. We do provide netting on some of the bales, and a lot of our producers will utilize that. We can also provide fencing through our programs to fence in these stored grains as well, to keep not only the turkeys out, but the deer as well. We have pretty high white-tailed deer populations as well, and you can imagine that producers in a tough winter year in particular don't like having all of those animals in there feeding on their storage grains.
I could see why.
That makes sense.
that'd be a problem. So I've never heard of a model like that, with a harvest model like that, where you're kind of using the fall hen season to moderate that conflict.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot like deer population management.
Yeah,
absolutely.
What we're typically used to.
Yep.
But we typically don't have that problem with too many turkeys.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind having it. I wouldn't mind seeing what it's like.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, right? You want to have enough birds to provide hunting opportunities for our hunters out here, and then when you get to a point where the private landowners are dealing with all the depredation, we've got to be able to have a tool to come in there and say, hey, we can help you out. We can kill some hens and lower this population some, and most of those folks are plumb happy with that. They're like, yep, let's we like having turkeys. We just don't want to have 500 turkeys.
Yeah.
Maybe 100 or 200 is okay, not 500.
Yeah. Well, and that's a problem we're not accustomed to down in my part of the world, where you have fall or winter flocks that are hundreds of birds. That's, I don't see that around here.
It's easy to see how they could sweep through and cause some problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, in particular in our prairie habitat areas, you might have an entire riparian zone, 20 miles of riparian corridor, but there's only one ranch along that corridor that has stored feed, right, or grains. So you're talking every bird comes to that place, and so if there's 300-400 birds on that place, they're feeding them all winter. But then in the spring and summer, they're gone. I mean, they disperse. They're out where they're supposed to be, and they're not a problem. And then they come back in about December, January, and say, hey, where's the food here? And that's kind of a scenario we deal with, where we've got a lot of birds maybe on one producer's place, and that's where we can send hunters. Then we can he'll give us a call, and we're like, hey, we'll send some fall hunters your way, and hopefully that will help alleviate some of that problem.
Yeah. Well, Chad, that kind of leads into another question that I had. It's really commonplace in the South, at least, and some other parts of the country that I'm aware of, for people to lease their land for hunting. Is that something that's really common? Does that help curtail this conflict, not just by removing animals, but also by offsetting the costs of carrying a lot of turkeys?
Yep. Oh, for sure. And as I mentioned, most of the land that's east of the Black Hills is private. So we deal with private landowners, obviously, on those properties. And yes, there is leased hunting out there. There's outfitters that lease these private lands just for hunting. So you're absolutely right. Those properties want more turkeys, more deer, so it helps offset, I think, some of that. Whereas if you're dealing with just a producer, all they are interested in is producing cattle or crops. That's a different scenario. So you've got kind of two different types of land types out there. And then there's a third land type where our private biologists go out and they visit with private landowners, and they can do a lease with the state. So we sign in an agreement with them where we pay them for public land access, and that's called the walk-in program.
Yeah.
And we've been really successful in leasing private lands for public use. And a lot of our turkey hunters right now, as a matter of fact, are utilizing those properties right now to hunt on.
Yeah, it's a great program.
Do you feel like, kind of building off of that, Chad, do you feel like the growing market for turkey hunting in your state has potentially increased the number of acres that are being conserved, not just for turkeys, but other species that might be grassland dependent or facultative?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, turkeys are just one species that our folks come here to hunt. Obviously, grouse,
Mm-hmm.
pheasants are our number one species that people come to hunt South Dakota in. So the hunting economy is a huge driver of what takes place with our private producers out there on the landscape. So we've got, obviously deer hunting's a giant out there for not only for outfitting, but for families to hunt for whitetails and mule deer. Turkey hunting's a big one. But then the upland bird hunting component, when you're talking about grouse and pheasant hunting, um, that is a monster for our economy, particularly in the fall.
Yeah.
We have lots of outfitters out there that are just there for upland bird hunting as well.
Sure.
So I was curious along those same lines, do you have a feel for what proportion of those landowners are strictly a producer versus those that are, kind of stacking income with leasing?
Boy, off the top of my head, I sure wouldn't have those numbers for you. I think we could get those with our private lands program. I'm sure they've got that a ballpark of what we would have out there for that, but I don't have that off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, I was just curious, how is that the model, or and not being having the hunting leasing interest rare, or is it balanced? So that's why I was asking.
Yeah. No, I would just probably have to just say just generally, if you went out and just started knocking on doors, you'd probably have, I don't know, 50% or 60% of them might be outfitted west of the Missouri, and maybe the other percentages of those would be just producers.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just kind of guessing at that.
Ballparking.
Yeah.
Well, still, yeah. So your feel for it seems like it's fairly balanced between the two
I think
strategy.
So.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sounds like if Chris does any survey work, that might be another opportunity for a study.
Not trying to add any research.
Absolutely, that could be something that we have Luke asking when he's knocking on doors.
Well, and I'll tell you, when Luke's out there, and I've been in the field with Luke quite a bit. A lot of those properties we get access on are outfitted in for sure in Gregory County. I mean, there's guys that basically have that land leased that it's just paid turkey hunters are coming on those properties. So it's interesting. You've got the guy who owns the land, he's producing cattle, right? But then he's got an outfitter that's paying him to just a general lease, and then he brings on deer and turkey hunters. And so it's kind of funny. To go in sometimes to mark a nest, we got to call the outfitter because they might have a turkey hunter on that place. And so we don't call the producer, we call the outfitter and say, hey, we got to go in and mark this turkey nest. We got a hen incubating. So he'll be like, yeah, we're not in there today. Go ahead, or something to that effect. So yeah, there's definitely the outfitting presence is out there.
Yeah, that's good that they're working with y'all. I just kind of wanted to throw out a general question as our time kind of starts winding down. Is there anything we've touched on a lot of very interesting aspects of population status trajectory and the research y'all have completed so far, but is there anything that we're kind of missing related to any of your research discoveries or anything like that?
Yeah, I think we touched on the big things that I was interested in. That hang being a big source of hen mortality. Hunting being a small but not zero source of the hen mortality, and these are bearded hens that are getting legally harvested, and the importance of that hen survival, right? And it's an special double whammy when the hens are killed when incubating.
Yeah, and that seems to continually pop up as a important, one of the most important, if not the most important, vital rate across a huge swath of this species range.
Yeah, that's right.
Chris, I know you said that was this. I think you said that it was the second most prevalent cause of mortality. Is that right in that study?
Yeah.
What percentage of the hens were being lost to that?
I think for our cause-specific mortality, and Chad, correct me if my ballpark is wrong, but I think 10% of those that were harvested or that died were hayed. And so
that sounds about right. Yep.
If 50% of our
hens died in 1 year, it would be about 10% were lost to haying, which is remarkable. Like that's a high number that compared to other studies.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and the Tennessee study was pretty similar, although I don't think the hens were being killed. It was just nest loss, right?
Yeah, it was nest. Yeah.
But so you're almost getting to your 60% growing population if you subtract that.
That's right. If you completely get rid of it, which is unlikely.
Right.
Yep.
That's why I was asking, is it practical? But so on the ones that are leasing the hunting rights to an outfitter or what have you, are those landowners more likely not to be engaged in practices during that time, like haying?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just like anything else, right, there's a ton of variability. I think you're going to have producers that definitely will hold off on haying until that July timeframe if they can afford it. It's the primary driver here is economics. So they've got to get that hay off. They're going to get that hay off.
Yeah.
But if you got a wildlife friendly producer that maybe is getting quite a bit of income, right, from hunting, they probably are more likely to have wildlife friendly practices. And the thing we always try and promote when we're out there with these guys, with our private lands biologists, is best management practices, right? So we're always constantly sharing this information with them, updating them with our research, all that stuff, so that they have the best information available, so they can make the decisions that they need to for their families and their businesses. So I think the other thing that I think is really critically important that we need to talk about as well is the amount of variability we see annually, year to year. This Gregory County study is a great example of that. We were losing birds almost from day one when we started radio coloring birds in Gregory County last year because we had a really bad winter, pretty wet spring. We were seeing high predation rates almost all the way through nesting season, winter through nesting. This year, I don't believe we maybe have lost 1 or 2 turkeys this year since we started trapping in January. We have had an incredibly mild winter this year in Gregory County. And so we may just see just an incredible variability from this year compared to last year. So Luke's study is going to be really interesting to see what we get here this coming year.
I see Marcus over there. He's jotting down April 2026, South Dakota.
Yeah, that was not what I was doing, but you made me think of something else that I wanted to Google real fast, but instead I'll just ask. So we're expecting, what, 1 trillion cicadas? Are those extending up to you guys?
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
No, I don't think that big hatch goes all the way up there.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
So we do get cicadas. I mean, we'll definitely, they're cyclical here. We'll hear them in some years a lot more than other years, but I don't know that we've ever quantified how many we have. I know turkeys eat them. Turkeys like to eat them, so they'll eat those buggers. But
yeah, well, I just looked. They go up to Wisconsin, but not up all the way to you guys. The broods that are hatching this year, but yeah, so across the eastern United States, pretty much from Canada all the way down and into the deep south. That's what someone estimated total how many to expect, and it was 1 trillion is the soundbite.
That's a nice round number to come up with.
Yeah, where do they come up with that one, right?
Yeah.
What are the confidence intervals around that?
Plus or minus 500 billion, and it's still an enormous amount. So I was curious about that, because if you line up all of those weather conditions with essentially an unlimited food source, we might really see them blow the top off of this thing. So I'm really excited to see what does happen in the range where cicadas are hatching. But
our poults here, for the most part in South Dakota, they're keying in on orthopterans or beetles early, and then grasshoppers, orthopterans or grasshoppers later. So right around the first 14, 15 days, when the poults are pretty much stuck to the ground and they're walking around, they're eating a lot of beetles, Coleoptera, and then they move into orthopterans or grasshoppers. And, grasshoppers, that's a big piece of protein. So they're keying in on those big hoppers, primarily, mid to late June through August. It's pretty funny. If you guys have ever watched a brood when they're going through a meadow, that's when the meadows are important, right? That's when they're out there feeding on those insects. When they're chasing those grasshoppers, it's awesome watching them hunt those things down and eat grasshoppers. It's a critically important food source for them to put on the mass they need to before fall.
Right.
Yeah. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Is there anything else that you'd really like for folks to know or think about?
Yeah, I'll just end with, if you're thinking about coming someplace to turkey hunt and want to try someplace new and exciting, this place is for you. I mean, we've got everything from eastern turkeys east of the Missouri, obviously, to Merriam's West River. So our populations are rebounding, it appears, and we've got a ton of public land in the Black Hills and great opportunities for folks that want to go on an adventure in a new state. Come on out to South Dakota. We'd appreciate it. Just don't hunt my spot.
Yeah. Does that invite come with some Onyx points, Chad?
Well, I'll tell you what I tell all the turkey hunters that call me almost daily. There's lots of great public land out there in the Black Hills, and if you're willing to get out and hike or drive a little bit, you can scout and find them. I mean, there's birds available. They're gobbling, and you can find them. So just remember, there's going to be more birds south. As we talked about that gradient, right, with the weather. Southern hills will have fewer in the northern hills, but you got to expect more hunting pressure that follows that same gradient. You'll have some company potentially as you move north to south as well. So.
Yeah,
I'm sold.
Good to know.
I'm going to book a trip for next
year.
You
and me both. We need to
I'm going to call Chad and ask him for one of those farms that's storing grain.
There you go.
Yeah, Will, can you stay on after so we can figure out plane tickets? Yeah, it's good stuff, guys. Well, yeah, go ahead, Will.
I was just going to say it was really nice to meet both of you and get to chat about this stuff, and it's always fascinating to see what everybody else is involved in and what we're learning, and trying to take those bits and pieces of information and assimilate that back into what we're learning, range wide about this species. But it's also interesting, Marcus, at the same time to see, some of the similarities that even a place like Florida can have, in common, can share with South Dakota. When it comes to turkeys, there's different factors influencing the bird differently in different areas, but there's also many similarities they share.
Yeah. It's summer severity here, probably more so than winter severity, but yeah, you're right. It was really fun talking to you guys and thinking about the constraints on turkey populations that you deal with, and it's always enlightening to get challenged some from the way that I'm thinking things. So appreciate you guys taking some time to do that.
And well, thanks for the invite and what you guys.
Thank you very much. It was great talking to you guys.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Y'all too. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate all the support. And like always, we'll link contact information and papers that we've covered and everything in the show notes. Thanks everybody.
Cool. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.